So thank you for that very kind introduction. And we've been asked to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and then I think we're going to open it up for hopefully a fruitful conversation. I wanted to set the context because the course that I'm going to be talking about, or that I use these strategies on, is an ed policy course, which is an AC course. And so it tends to bring in ed minors, but then also people for whom this is the only time they're ever going to talk about issues of race and inequality. And the course looks historically at the establishment of the educational system and then tries to link that to current reform efforts and why the ways we construct groups historically is still present today. And I say that because I think the context of and the content of the course really does matter. And so I'm not going to claim I have answers to any of this. I'm just going to tell you how I muddle through best I can, but really thinking about how your course material then kind of brings a certain kind of students and then what their expectations are of the space. And I think the key issue for me is really how do you construct the space and realizing you have to take a lot of time and be very deliberate about constructing the space, and that it's an ongoing process over the course of the semester. It's not something you start at the beginning and are done with, and that I think the professor really does set the tone. And what I try to do is actually talk about my own be vulnerable in front of the students and talk about what I bring to the class, why I'm teaching the class, make clear that there is no such thing as objectivity or a right answer, that the issues we're grappling with are actually quite complex, and that I feel like my goal is to teach them how to work through their own biases and their own processes through the class. And so I'm not only teaching them the course material, but I'm really teaching them how to be active thinkers and consumers of information relevant to politics. And so, making clear to them that my point of view is actually embedded in the syllabus, right? And that we shouldn't act as if that's not true, and that in fact there are things I don't know. And I have to say that now that I, have a little bit of gray in my hair and have been doing this for a while, I'm much more comfortable saying that than I was. Like, my biggest terror when I started teaching was having somebody ask me something I didn't know. So I do appreciate that your position, where you are in your career affects the degree of vulnerability you can have. But I think that it makes students feel better for me to say, so the last time I taught this course was right when the Trump administration took over in spring of 2017. And Betsy DeVos had just become Secretary of Education, and there, in the news literally every day there was something new about what she was changing. And so they would ask, well, what can she do to community colleges? And I could say, I don't know, let's find out. And so the next class, if people ask you things you don't know and you say you're going to find out, you bring the information back, and I think that helps to build that sense of trust and that we're working through these things together. Similarly, I've worked in Congress, and I talk a lot about Congress in the class, and I had to say, basically, everything I know about how Congress works no longer seems valid. So let's think about, I don't know, how is this going to work out? And I do think that idea that there isn't sort of a perfect answer, I think is important to producing the kind of space where you can have these conversations. And so what we do is we use what are called community agreements, which is something that community organizations do, but you set out a set of kind of principles of how we're going to engage in conversation. Some standard ones are, take space, make space, the idea that if you're sort of cognizant of how much space you're taking up, and so if you're talking too much, kind of pull back, and also to be able to own the space for people who aren't comfortable. And this is a very large class, so it's important to make people feel comfortable engaging, but I think also the expectation that the course is going to produce discomfort. I think we have this idea that somehow grappling with hard issues shouldn't actually make you feel bad or weird or sad or shouldn't elicit any kind of emotion. And I think that setting the expectation that in fact finding out information that may run contrary to your idea about how the United States has worked historically may actually make you emotionally unhappy, and that's okay. And so I think we tend to talk about civility as this idea that everyone should feel perfectly fine and have equilibrium all the time. But in fact, if you're really actually working through some complicated issues, you should in fact feel uncomfortable, and that is in fact the point. And then you can talk through how do you kind of work through that discomfort, right? But I think talking about productive discomfort is really useful. And then I have a couple of non-negotiables in the sense that evidence really matters. And so like I was saying, when I say I don't know something, I will bring my answer, but I will show where I got that answer, what evidence, what empirical foundation we have. Because again, the university has to stand for something, and I think what the university has to stand for at a minimum is that we in fact base our arguments and our opinions on facts. And that facts do actually exist, and we can decide when they're real. and that I strongly encourage students to participate, and I say that evidence is not only, you know, data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but it also can be your personal experiences. And when you're talking about education, everybody has personal experiences, and I think also saying that knowledge comes from different places and that those things are valid, but that when we share that knowledge or that we share that evidence, that we never attack another person, right? That we appreciate that people of goodwill can disagree, but that in order to have a conversation, it has to be about the issues at hand and not about kind of your judgments about other people's lived experience. And so that is sometimes a difficult line to manage, but I do try. And this is the part where you have to continually, if people make comments or engage in ways that you think are inappropriate, you have to continually kind of work through and talk through why it is or why it isn't, so that the space continues to feel safe for people. Because the fact of the matter is, folks who are marginal often are not able to have their experiences be visible in our classrooms. And so making that possible is in fact an ongoing process. And the last thing I'll say is that it's really important then to work with your GSIs, because many of them have not had experience necessarily very much in the classroom, to really talk through how they construct their spaces, how they manage their conversations. And I meet with them every week to just check in and say, like, okay, what's going on? Are there particular issues coming up? How are the conversations going? How are students feeling? And so I think if you manage all of that, hopefully what you get at the end is not only students who have the material, but ideally have the tools to be able to be critical thinkers and go forward and ask questions about their own assumptions as they move through their political life. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I teach immigration classes, so I teach a AC class that is about 50 students, which is immigration in global perspective, but largely focused on the United States, but then in conversation, largely with Western Europe or Canada and Australia. And I also teach small senior seminars, 190s, which I've done a number of different things. Some of them have just been a standard seminar, some of them have been engaged scholarship, where students have interned at community organizations. And I sometimes go in and do sort of module lectures in a large class we have in sociology, comparative societies. I'm not doing that as much, but I would go in for like 2-3 class sessions and do a little module on immigration, and that would be 200 people. So, you know, I think the strategies transform, obviously, when you have a small group and you can build a bigger sense of community versus the 200-person lecture where people are hiding and you're not entirely sure what people are doing. So I'm going to talk largely about the 50-person class. So that is a class that I taught last spring, and I'll be teaching it again this spring. And I told Victoria when she asked me to be on this panel that actually I haven't figured any of this out. And I really do think that things have fundamentally changed with the election of Donald Trump. And let me talk through why I'm not sure what I'm doing anymore, because I thought I'd sort of figured things out before, and I just don't know anymore. So November 2016, what I would do is I'd usually start the course talking about the politics of immigration, and I'd make a strong case that the politics of immigration in the United States are a case of what's called strange bedfellows, and that if you look within the Republican Party, there's been a strong pro-immigrant economic wing, and that there's also a strong sort of socially conservative, more nativist, or at least worried about immigration wing, but that within the Democratic Party you have a strong economic protectionist wing that has been historically very anti-immigrant, and that in also the Democratic Party you have the more cosmopolitan types who have been very pro-migrant. And you know, I would give them very specific pieces of legislation. I would point out that in 1986, the last time the US did an amnesty which legalized 3 million people, the United Farm Workers came out against the amnesty because they very much did not want to have wages undercut. And you know, a lot of our students would be, what? You know, United Farm Workers? They were against amnesty, so that's kind of surprising. And then I'd point out too that the US Chamber of Commerce has been pretty vocal about being in favor of legalization from a very business, sort of free trade, liberal perspective. And I would start the class like that just to say, you know, we can't use partisan labels to understand that. I don't think we can say that quite as definitively nowadays. And the internal fights within the Republican and Democratic Party have really changed. I mean, the Democrats are much more all singing the same tune. The Republicans, clearly the social conservatives, have taken the ascendancy. So I did it last semester, but I think it rang hollow to the students. So it's not doing what I wanted it to do, which was, whatever your politics are, think a little bit about how there are tensions within that politics when it comes to immigration. And so, like I said, I'm really not quite sure what to do moving forward. I have invited students to send to me an email if there's something in the current events, like if something comes across their newsfeed, that if they want more background, they can email me about it, and then I usually take 5 to 10 minutes in class to give a little bit of background. And since with migration, every single week is bringing something out of this administration. And so I was teaching when DACA was being litigated. So a lot of students had no clue what DACA was. And so I gave them a little primer about what is DACA, what's the history of it. Refugee resettlement has been cut yet lower again, and so I would give them a little slide to show what the history of refugee resettlement has been in the US and sort of show where that number is. And so I guess one way that I've dealt with current events is not necessarily take them on head on, but at least try to give background information so that they can place it in a larger conversation. The other thing that I feel has shifted a little bit is that I think that often, but not always, in conversations around marginalized populations, in the social sciences and even more in the humanities, epistemologically, people have tried to challenge what might be considered a narrow positivist approach, right? So the deconstruction of categories, the questioning of whether, say, statistics gives us all the answers, the raising up of personal experience as an important data point or an important point of view. And then obviously for some people that then comes with theoretical orientations in terms of standpoint theory or postmodernism, etc. I've always been, on the more empirical side, but I've had conversation about that, and I've definitely tried to challenge and reification of categories and such. Again, I feel like I'm in a different place now, because in the classroom, to the extent that we're challenging knowledge and we're challenging the taken for granted, I feel sometimes that I'm actually feeding into this conversation about fake news. We can't trust anything. Nothing is truth anymore. So there's this weird change, whereas previously I think people who have been advocating for more marginalized populations have said, let's challenge our taken for granted knowledge, and now it feels like it's really changed, where it's like nothing's true anymore, and therefore my nativist, populist, racist viewpoint is just as valid as everybody else's. And so I'm really hitting even harder than I probably did before on facts, on how do we collect data, what does the university give us, what is a research methodology, and can, maybe everyone has their point of view, but can we say that certain points of view might be buttressed by more other points of view or other empirical evidence, versus everyone is allowed their own personal opinion. And this feels really strange, because I'm very sympathetic to the argument that historically science has really privileged certain groups over others. So in my classes, I put a lot of emphasis on getting students to have some basic numeracy skills. And so they have to go through immigration statistics from the department, from US Citizenship and Immigration. And they have to do a timeline over the last 100 years of a particular immigrant group and show how many people entered the country, and then they have to overlay that with legislation to be able to show that after the Chinese Exclusion Act, big surprise, there were way fewer Chinese who came in. And interestingly, I didn't find any of this pretty radical. I mean, legislation can make a difference. But for many of the students, they found this really revelatory. They hadn't really thought that legislation could make a difference. And then when you see the peaks of those numbers just go slamming down after the national origin quotas in 1921-24, they're like, oh my gosh, this politics matters in a way. The other thing I do, which is very much different from the, let's look at the statistics, is students are taught how to do an oral history interview. So they all do an oral history interview, and they have to interview an immigrant, and I say, someone who's been in the country for 5 years, etc. And I tell them that they're allowed to interview a parent or a family member. In fact, I even encourage it, because I've had more than one student come to me and say, I've never had that conversation with my father, my grandmother, my aunt. Because there's never a space to have this kind of conversation, and especially for those people whose parents or family members have had extremely difficult migration experiences. Either say they came across the border without inspection, or they're refugees. They were, they tried to escape a particular situation multiple times, really experienced very significant hardship. That's not something people can talk about very easily in sort of your day-to-day life. But when the student has this, my professor told me that I have to do this, that it gives them cover. It gives them cover to be able to have that conversation with a family member. For those people who don't come from immigrant families or don't want to, then they can interview anybody else. And more than one student has told me that that has been an extremely powerful experience, because then they're able to talk about the readings, which is about why people migrate, what integration's like, etc., and then they put in a conversation with the person that they've interviewed. It isn't always revelatory. Sometimes people interview very privileged migrants who tend to have a much easier time of things. And so in some cases it can sort of maybe reinforce certain stereotypes about immigration. But I still give them those tools, and then we talk about what do we get out of interviews that we don't get out of like these statistics from administrative data, and back and forth. The only other thing I would add is that one thing that I'd never done before, but I did this last spring, was you'll remember that there was a moment on campus where people from USCIS were on campus, and they were doing the global travel thing so that you could not do TSA. And there was a moment that there was incredible fear among some of our immigrant students about what were they doing on campus. And at that moment, I decided I had to address it in the classroom. And luckily, the class had been going on for a while, so I think we had built a little bit of a sense of community, or at least maybe some sense of safe space. And I asked the students in groups to talk about what would be our community or our classroom procedures if ICE agents showed up at the door. And I said to them, I think the chance of this happening is minuscule. I don't think it will happen, but I do think we need this conversation about what would we do. And that was very difficult conversation. I mean, I think the students who would be very worried about that were very worried about what other students were going to be saying, and whether a student would say, yeah, of course we should give my fellow student to an ICE agent. I mean, I don't think that was the sense of the classroom, but I think the fear was real. And then, of course, the students who have very secure legal status, who were born in the United States and then don't have those kind of concerns, they weren't sure what to say because they didn't want to offend anyone, they didn't want to scare anyone. And so it was an awkward conversation. And so after that, I asked people to email me their comments, their suggestions, and I got a fair number of emails, and then I crafted it all together and I put it into a document, and I put down what Chancellor Christ had said, and I gave the UCOP information, and then I handed it out and I said, this was our document for our class, allowed one more set of revisions, comments, and then we sort of had that as our class document. But I'm not sure that I'd love to know how else I could have done that, because the conversations they felt very difficult. Let's just put it this way. I didn't get, sometimes when conversation goes really well, and you're like, all right, we're rocking it, it's really good. That was not happening during this conversation. So yeah, I don't have answers.
Well, it seemed like it was a lot of answers, yeah. So I'd echo what my colleagues have said already. In fact, many of their points touch on my points. So I teach, so right now I'm in a little bit of a funny position, because I tend to teach these broad, like 100 plus undergraduate courses that are gateway courses. So I'm teaching sociology of culture, which on the surface itself is not sort of race and ethnicity or immigration course, but I do bring a lot of material on inequality. For example, in this culture class right now, we have a module on sort of assimilation and acculturation, right? It's not traditionally the way this class is taught, but I'm teaching it, so that's what I'm doing. So I do bring this in these ways, but the course is not an AC course right now. And then I teach a very small graduate course on race and ethnicity. So on the one hand, I am sort of grappling with this very intensely at a graduate level, which is a bit different, and on the other hand, I have sort of a more gateway course, and so some of my thoughts will come out of that. I think that, so we're also teaching at a moment when things are going on. And so I remember teaching these courses, when Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri. I remember coming to both of these courses that week. And I remember just sort of thinking, for my graduate course, I couldn't just teach. I think I forget what we were reading, but it was not on sort of, violence in African American communities, about policing. It wasn't about that. And I just felt really strongly that I couldn't just go ahead with the content at hand. So I got to the graduate course and I said, this is what we're reading, this is what we read, we can have this conversation or we cannot. We can have, as sort of you all that are going to be trained as sociologists and move on with this content and do what you do with it in the world, whether you become professors or policymakers or not, we can have the conversation that you want to have. And we did. It was pretty great. It was about sort of what is the role of sociology in thinking about social change. It was about, we read all this stuff, but what do we do with it? It's about what is the long game in sort of academia and thinking about inequality. If we write about it now, if what we're writing about gets published 2 years later, what does that mean? And I think what was great about that is that, at least for graduate students, I didn't have the answer and I felt as frustrated as everybody else and I felt completely demoralized, but it just really felt like a moment where I couldn't come in and just sort of teach, right? It's a very special environment in which we're all sort of very well, prepared. We've had all this preparation and all this learning, and yet the world is going on around us. And so I think every so often creating those moments, we eventually did get around to the subject at hand, but I think the students appreciated this, and in part because we're human too. We're human, and we're reading this stuff about inequality, about sort of the history of the nation, and it is about theory, and it is about learning and engagement with these ideas. But then we have to go home, and then we turn on the news, and then we have to be engaged citizens ourselves. And so I think creating that space, I would say that space for graduate students more easily opens up with, over drinks at a bar, or later on if you can create these spaces of dinner at your home. I found that every so often I'll have my last grad class at my home, and it creates this space for them to really talk about this, because as we are learning to become academics, as we are learning to become consumers of knowledge, we have to learn sort of what role academia itself is playing in society, the way it itself is reproducing inequality or sort of marginalizing certain ideas. And I think this is, if we become to consume with just sort of thinking about what is that professional trajectory, we lose these very valuable opportunities right now to really talk about where are we going, right? That said, for my undergraduate classes, because I do often have content, so I teach another class that I haven't taught for a while, but it's called Race and Politics. But blanket statement for all of my undergraduate classes, I usually start by the first or second lecture with what I call the critical speaking speech. And so I allow one lecture to flow, and then we see who raises their hand or whatnot. And the second lecture often start from sort of my own experience as an undergraduate here at Berkeley, in which I sort of talk to them, and I think the students really sort of appreciate the fact that I can sort of speak about their feelings because I had them. So I'll speak about the fact about when I was a sort of undergrad here at Berkeley. It was the first of my family to go to college, parents are immigrants, and how I always felt sort of very severely this imposter syndrome, right? Thought I was a fraud. I thought, sort of I had gotten in here by mistake, and that really sort of helped to silence me throughout a lot of my classes. I'd sit in the back, I wouldn't really engage, and it really took sort of a moment of sort of reflection. And the moment of reflection wasn't necessarily a moment of, oh yeah, I'm really smart, or oh yeah, I know all this. It wasn't actually that. What the moment of reflection was about was the moment of reflection of understanding the inequality and the patterns across the classes I was taking. So I sort of sat back, I remember by my junior year, and sort of realized, the students of color weren't speaking, there weren't that many, women raising their hands, things of the sort. Professors always have this Q&A session, but only certain students participate. And so I remember sort of thinking very deeply that, unless I sort of spoke out and unless I started becoming an active participant, this would continue. And so I remember by my junior year sort of willing and forcing and daring myself to speak in class. I remember my stomach would churn before a lecture because I had this sort of personal dare that was built on the sense that this is unfair, we should have a more inclusive class discussion. So I laid this entire story out to students. I tell them exactly where I would sit, and I tell them that by the end of the semester, fall of my junior year, other peers in my class would come up to me and say, hey, you're the girl that speaks in class all the time. And I lay this out to tell them that here at Berkeley, we want to foster not only critical thinking and critical writing, but we very much want to foster critical speaking. And I sort of find that if I show them the inequalities laid out that they probably see but are not sort of reflecting on it as a pattern across campus, it really helps to open up that space. And then, of course, are all the tricks that all of us as educators use to sort of create those spaces, right? It's about the small groups, send me discussion or reflection questions over email. But I find that actually just telling them, I can see you, I went through this, I know it's hard, your stomach is probably hurting, but just engage with us because this will be a better class, that we have this one opportunity to really grapple as a community with this idea. So come with me and I will create that space for you. I think that really helps a lot. Like Irene said, at this moment, it's a really interesting time because I'm much more going back to the facts than I ever have before, sort of drawing on census figures, sort of talking about what sort of net migration looks like are we having, is it unprecedented levels, things of the sort. And I find myself going back to the facts and actually doubling down on more facts, and here are all the citations for these facts. In ways that I probably had not to that level before. So I'll just say two more things. I think teaching right now at this moment, what has been helpful for me is the arts. I think bringing in sort of short film clips, music has helped, art pieces, poetry even into the classes, sort of as expressions of sort of feelings of inequality, feelings of outsiderness, feelings of foreignness, has helped in a way to, I think, open up new spaces for discussion. So, for example, we have a session on music, so it's the sociology of culture, so how music is produced, etc. And I often put snippets of songs that are really popular in the Black Lives Matter movement, like songs by Kendrick Lamar, for example, or even just going back, Nina Simone, for example. And I find that this sort of allows them to connect to the lyrics in ways that speaks to them and to their moment, and that opens up that political conversation in ways that just sort of the dry text reading doesn't allow for that. And I think the last thing is that, so this has happened while I've been teaching at Berkeley now. I've been here for about 7 years now. And this is why I think a lot of us love teaching at Berkeley, but it's happened much more now, is that our students, or my students, often push me, especially in sociology classes, to sort of give them the answer of now what do we do? You showed us all these patterns of inequality. You showed us, you've exposed history, you've done all this. What do we do to change it? And I think that more than ever right now, even the small little things are important. I think students really want to understand, so what are the glimmers of hope? How can we make this better? How can we push for a much more just and fair, humane sort of set of immigration policies, or policies about sort of anything, policing, etc. And I find myself looking for that stuff more. I find that this question is much more heightened of the what do we do. So I find myself much more now, so aside from the facts and sort of the course content, thinking about small little ways in office hours or at the end of lectures about, okay, where's the ray of hope? Where's that opening? I can't always find it, and I go nuts thinking about this sometimes, but I find that students are asking for that even more so now.
Wow, so a lot of food for thought, and I'm wondering, it feels like, could you do what we did at the beginning, is turn to each other and something comes out of the comments already from our panelists that is sitting in your mind as something you want to ask further about, or something that's just getting generated? You want to take 5 minutes to turn to each other and then reflect on the discussion so far, and we'll come back to our panelists.
Okay, let's bring some of these questions through to the panelists. Good morning. So my question is, so I'm in the College of Engineering, and I'm trying to understand how to help faculty implement some of these strategies in engineering spaces where we don't really have the conversation, but we are cognizant that there's implicit bias and marginalizing and all of that happening throughout the college. So how do we do that? Is there any suggestion?
That's a really hard question. I'm going to start again with, I don't know, but I would imagine that it would have to start with having some conversations among the faculty about how they structure their classrooms. And I realize, and I know there probably are a good number of folks in engineering who want to do this better, but perhaps feel like they don't have the tools. At least that's my sense of some of the folks I know in the college. And so I think start with your allies and see about providing supports to them. And maybe even, I know with faculty it's really hard to get folks to have time to be able to meet, but if you could have some kind of constructive working group where people talk through what works and what doesn't for exactly the things that Christina was talking about in terms of thinking about how do you make people's holding of the space more egalitarian, right? And how do you get people to recognize those inequalities, and how do you get folks to appreciate that just the way they present material, right, really matters. So for example, I was having a conversation with Bob Bergeneau, and when he said when he was at MIT, he made a concerted effort to talk about female physicists, right? To talk about female physicists, right? To just bring up stories and that how you frame even the production of scientific knowledge really matters, and that small changes like that of who you talk about, right, or who's when you talk about a particular concept that you mention, hey, there were women that actually were part of creating this thing, which isn't usually part of the conversation, that he found that really kind of changed the feel of the classroom, at least in his perception. And so I think appreciating that small things of just kind of thinking like, well, why do I talk about it this way? Are there other ways to bring other voices in that would reframe how people see science, right? Because we tend to see science as this kind of objective, reified thing, but rather to appreciate that how we talk about science, how we talk about scientific discovery, actually all these biases are embedded. So I would start with a small, group of interested faculty and see if you can kind of build a toolkit that then can be talked about and adopted by a broader set. And I bet there are lots of faculty in engineering who are already doing this. I'm going to act like nobody is. And so how do you build up what's there and kind of, I think if you make it easy for faculty, because often teaching, right, we're tired, we don't have the time we would like, you don't know where to find the information. I think the easier you can make it, the more likely it is you'll have people adopt. But I don't know if other folks have.
I mean, these are two suggestions. I agree with Christina's comment about critical speaking. And one way to do that in a space where people might not be ready to think structurally about why certain groups do and do not speak is just to ask the students to break into groups of people who are more extroverted and like to talk in classrooms, and people who are more introverted and would prefer to think through it and not talk in classrooms. And you break those into two different groups, and so discussion section would be easiest, but maybe you can even do it in a lecture. And then you have each of those groups talk about why they speak or why they don't speak, what could be done to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak, and then you go back and you have the group sort of report back to each other. And I think the people who tend not to speak as much can sometimes will appreciate, often the extroverts will say, but we really want everyone to speak. We don't understand why they don't just talk like us. But like hearing that they actually do want to hear from other people, I think can sometimes be good. And then there's a conversation about what can be the classroom expectations, and you don't do it based on things that, gender or race or economic background or something might be part of that. And I think that's an important conversation to have, which you can maybe have later. But you can just start with the introverts and the extroverts and then open that space. The other thing potentially to talk about, and this I learned from Victoria and the people at the ACES program, so the American Cultures Engaged Scholarship Program, is really lifting up knowledge from other sources. So this is, about the epistemology. And so in engineering, I wonder if it would be interesting to share with faculty or have faculty think about case studies where engineers thought they had the answer, and then with the application, it didn't quite work because they just didn't have the local knowledge on the ground. And so I think because then you can raise up the fact that people have local knowledge, and regardless of their background, even if they'd never finished high school, they know something and we got to listen to them. And so I think that helps also decenter this idea that just because you can do a bunch of fancy math, you're special. So.
And I think here, one part of it is definitely engaging the graduate students, the graduate student discussion section leaders, because I know sort of one dynamic is the broad classroom, but there are also sort of serious dynamics that happen in the smaller discussion section. So having them more cognizant of these patterns, I feel like that's a much more open conversation that you can have there. And the second thing I'm thinking about is, so aside from what everyone said, is what's super useful is, and here's just one idea. What's super useful to me is the mid-semester evaluation, where I sort of said what's going right, what's going wrong, and then one part is I can imagine just a broad question. What would make this feel like a more inclusive space for you? And just have it open, and so students can sort of say, this is how I'm feeling, or this is what's going on. There's something about just knowing that pulse. So when I have the what's going wrong, sometimes the what's going wrong is, it says not enough people are participating in discussion. And so then I can use that as an excuse. I started the class with like, look, all of you have said that you want to hear more from each other. So part of that is on me to sort of make you more comfortable, but part of that is on you too. So let's be engaged here too. But I think that the evaluation, the mid-semester, it's super easy, it goes through really quickly, can provide that sort of crutch or opportunity to have that conversation too.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Robert Stroud. I'm at the business school, and I just want to say thank you so much for the conversation, for constructing this. And I've heard a theme of going to the empirical evidence over and over again, and I appreciate that. And I happen to teach. I'm very interested in the Nordic region and what we can learn in how they approach capitalism and sustainability. And historically, I could just put the evidence there and say, look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the Nordic region is always outperforming when it comes to climate change policy or when it comes to any other kind of measure of sustainability. And I have been in the last 2 years kind of blindsided because I've relied upon that. But the Nordic agenda has been teed up as being, far right-wing outlets will say that the Nordics are communists, and this tees up a sort of kind of a very political agenda of the Nordic region that I hadn't necessarily intended. And so now this last time I taught a class where I brought, it was a required class, which means that there's a different distribution, and folks came over there and all the empiricals that I could put up to demonstrate this particular region of the world is doing very well from a sustainability perspective was effectively being seen as he's promoting a left-wing agenda. And I have finding myself struggling to say, how do I actually, in the face of here's the empirical, and it's just all seen as a political agenda, and what do I do about that? Because I do have a point of view, and I happen to think that there's something to be learned, but the whole thing was almost dismissed out of hand because this is a whole political agenda. And I would imagine that you're in more contentious areas than I am in the sustainability agenda. I don't know how to deal with that.
So when you open the class, do you sort of lay out your normative positionality in the sense of saying, I think climate change is real, I think sustainability is a good thing, here are all the reasons why? Do you frame it in that?
Effectively, that's there. I would start though saying, here are all the indicators of, by every measure of sustainability, looking why this particular cluster is actually outperforming the rest of the world. And implicit in there is, when you're outperforming in climate change, I believe that that's an important thing, and that is a real thing.
So I wonder if it wouldn't be useful, because I opened my class saying, I think educational inequality is bad. And like that I'm willing to take, like, I think the idea that we can't take positions, or that there's somehow, the goal is to have like both sides are equal in their, it creates false equivalency, that we have to have a moral, the ability to claim a normative goal, right? My normative goal is for children to be able to actually reach their full potential, regardless of their race, class, inequality, right? And I do think it helps to sort of just be explicit about that, because then it's not, you can call it a political agenda or not, but that's the reason I teach this class is because I think this is important. If I didn't think it was important, I wouldn't be doing this job, right? And so I think kind of that makes, because otherwise then maybe I feel like then that people think you're trying to sneak it in, rather than, I mean, I'm not sure if this will fix it, because my student population is probably different than the folks that are in your class, but I think at a minimum it's like you laid out there, and that's why I teach this class, and this is why I think it's important. And I'm going to talk to you about the places in the world that I think are doing a better job. But, you know, otherwise, but I think there, you know, the idea that we can actually bring everybody along is probably a false one, and I think all you can do is try to kind of be as open and honest in your classroom as you can, and to try to, you know, say that this isn't, I didn't pull this out of the air. But I think also, at least in mine, it's useful to really say, because it's part of what Christina was talking about bringing the world into your classroom. I think there's been a way in which, at least within politics, it's been an argument about, as if like either side who wins doesn't really matter. And I think what I try to talk about in my class is that actually the stakes are really high for some people. The potential impact is huge. And so we can't just act like, oh, it's either I pick this or I pick that, and that there's no kind of moral center that we have to be, that sort of fairness and equity is the core. And then we have to think about policies within the context of that, rather than just sort of, it's a world of competing ideas and it's just a matter of which one you pick. Personally, that's not, I don't think that's our job. And I don't know if that'll help, but that's just a thought.
That's very helpful.
I do something slightly actually different. So I didn't do it since Trump was elected, so I don't know how this would change. But I had an assignment. So in sociology, we do, you know, usually all empirical, etc. And I had them read a few political theory pieces about open borders, and they just had to read it. And then I had also a less pro-border kind of, a less open border perspective. And then one of their assignments is to write an argument about what should immigration policy be in the United States. And I tell them, I say, you are allowed to advocate for open borders. That is absolutely fine, but you have to think very seriously about the consequences if you adopt an open border perspective. And then I also argue, realize if you adopt an open border perspective, there will be hundreds of thousands of people who will be coming in. And if you're worried about price, rents in the Bay Area, and you're worried about not enough schools and things like that, you're going to have to think through the consequences. And then for the people who don't want open borders, I say, for you guys, you're going to have to try to figure out what is the number of people we let in and on what basis, because as soon as you don't have open borders, you must make decisions between human beings. And so you're going to have to articulate a moral stance as to why some people are allowed in and other people are not allowed in. And the students hate it, because you have to make choices, and it's real, right? And so then they're sitting there going, oh, but I really want to help refugees, but then on the other hand, if we give too many refugees, there's not going to be family reunification, and they hate the assignment. But they have to grapple with values. And so I say to them, you have to lay out your values, think about your values. They do what they have to do. And then we then go into the empirics of, if this was your value, how do you get there? Is that the way to get to your values? But they have to grapple with it in a way that's more serious than just oh, this party says this, or these people say that, and so therefore I'm going to be against it or for it. But yeah, they didn't like it at the start. By the end, they're okay.
That's called productive discomfort.
Sure.
Yeah. And that, but again, that it's not it's not a right or like these things are complicated, right? Especially if you're talking about public policies. There is no right answer. There is no simple answer, and I think that the degree to which, because on some level, sort of, adapting the label of like, well, this is, first of all, we don't even have a left in this country, so can we just even talk about that? But, that this is sort of the conservative versus is they're caricatures. And so I would hope we would ask our students to, in fact, not create straw men of that sort, and in fact, really get into what is at the core of an issue, right? And to not get away with that kind of simplistic dismissal of whole groups of people on either side.
One easy thing you can do is just sort of, because I'm wondering, what does that sort of pushback look like? Is it just sort of a small subset of students? Are you getting it from, because sometimes it could be just one very vocal student or two very vocal students that sort of make us destabilize us or make us question, but it's not a shared sentiment. And so offering that opportunity as a discussion point in class, like, well, some people have suggested this is, this and that. What other cases would I use to compare, or sort of making that as a moment and putting that back on them? And oftentimes that conversation won't really bubble up, and it allows you to see, what does that pushback look like? Is that a real sentiment, or is it, just the way we're working in politics right now, like one really vocal person?
Right.
Yeah.
And if it's a really big class, the iClicker surveys sometimes are a useful pedagogical tool for those purposes, to really kind of ask people their opinions and their life experiences and other kinds of things, but to put that context out there for all the ones who aren't talking.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Hi. So I teach environmental studies, and so I get a version of your problem all the time. And it reminds me of Stephen Colbert Report. Reality has a liberal bias, and there's a real problem in environmental studies, and probably in a lot of our fields, in which we have people with particular different kinds of political belief systems that aren't really as compatible with reality as others. And it's very difficult to deal with that. I came here today to start to grapple with that better. All great ideas. Bring up facts, bring up data, make policy that fits some kind of assigned position, or even let them choose their position and come up with make them do the hard decisions of allocating immigration or whatever resource allocation you're allocating. So I find it's a really interesting, possibly extremely productive conversation, and I think it really, frankly, goes pretty deep, like maybe a lot deeper than we've touched on here today, about communicating across political divides. And I was just speaking with Nia here, and she was telling me about her, I hope it's okay, I just mentioned this, that her frustration that sometimes in classes she'll have, a student will make a statement based on some kind of political position that's not very tenable according to what we know about facts, etc., and the faculty member will leave it there on the table unchallenged. And it's very frustrating because it kind of gives it this kind of aura of truthiness, to use another Colbert, that because it's unchallenged, it's there on the table. And maybe it's a truth, and it arises out of this kind of idea, I think, which is really at the basis of probably the problem we're discussing here, which is the contention, the idea that all views have some kind of validity to them. And
equal validity.
Or equal validity. Thank you. So to me, the depths that this gets into is, real deep ontologically and metaphysical assumptions that ground different political points of view and their policies, and how to challenge those in the classroom. And even further, part of my research is in environmental psychology. And what's happening now with global climate change and other problems is an entrenchment, because probably this is a really serious dynamic for this question of politics in the classroom, which is that denial arises and fear is arising over possible ecological collapse and societal collapse with the amount of contention we have going on in our politics and these other problems. So the idea, and the research is showing that people get into processes of denial and simply can't see global climate change for various reasons, or can't see the problems of immigration or the humanity of those immigrants. So we have some deeper things going on here. I'd love it if this would be a series of conversations. I think it really runs deep in questions of pedagogy and epistemology and metaphysics as well.
Well, you've all just been invited back. That's what I heard. Other questions, comments?
So any idea how to address what he just talked about, deeper, questions besides the whole series right now? Any other ideas on how to respond to that deeper?
I mean, I was just going to say, I think I'm lucky that education is a place where you can, very much like immigration, say it pops on both their houses, right? And that both parties have actually done harm over time. I think climate change is a little bit now more, but I mean, I think it is a deeper conversation about the role of higher education and to the extent to which we're going to maintain this idea of false equivalency, or if we're going to be a place that's really about training students to think empirically, to not let those statements, based on either fake information or inaccurate information, stand with equal weight, right? I mean, I think that it is a deep set of questions that intersects with being more inclusive in terms of who's in the front of the classroom as well, because I think it changes then how you talk about these things and how you live these things. The Muslim ban happened when I was teaching this class, and I had to share with the students, my parents were refugees, right? We were lucky that this country allowed us to come in. And so the stakes for me are different because of my life experiences. And so I think it's a big shift in how we do our work, but I think does require us to continually really rethink our practice and our purpose. And it's not easy, right? And some students will just think it's not valid or helpful or biased, or I think that the fact of the matter is not everybody's going to be happy and singing Kumbaya, because these are hard things. And so maybe if we don't have that expectation,
yeah,
it feels a little better as a professor, right? I don't know.
If I could not be bothered by the few evaluations that I get that say he's saying these things because he's a liberal.
But see, this is the psychology of evaluations, right? Like you can get stellar evaluations, yes, and you always, at least for me, right? You always focus on those ones that are like, that hate it. I think that's just human nature.
Yeah.
But we also know all the bias in evaluation too, right? So,
We have a question at the back.
I just wanted to add a comment, building a little bit on what Christina had said about the arts for this particular question of sustainability indicators. I think that, there's a lot of research showing how we interpret evidence to fit narratives, and how, visual storytelling can be a really compelling way of making a point rather than a trend line. And so I don't know, one idea is to actually maybe use documentaries or, clips that show what life is like in these societies and that break down stereotypes that some students may have about the incompetence or something to that effect. And to combine that, so not in lieu of the evidence that you present or the indicators, but just thinking about different ways of presenting sort of the story that you want to tell that might be more compelling, more gripping, that will give sort of people in these societies and their voice sort of front stage. And I imagine there's lots of material out there that you can probably just find on YouTube or documentaries of the sort. So, yeah.
And I also just sort of flip the deeper question onto them. And so I say, more than once I've found myself this semester saying, okay, these are the facts. I know we have different definitions of facts, but the definition that we're going to use is data collected in this way. And I'll tell them this, and they laugh or whatnot, but I'm consistently reminding them that we live in politically perilous times. and after every, I have modules in my class, so we look at, one module's on immigration assimilation, another one is on sort of the education of the elites, and that's the way I teach it. But after every module, I'm consistently going back, okay, why is this important to know right now? And I ask that question to them, why is it important to know right now in the context that we live in the context of social media, in the context of sort of the political polarization in this context? And I think that sort of continuous reflection, and I haven't done this before, I've just been motivated to do it now more so because students are asking more about what do we do with this? What do I do, more broadly, not just what do I do with this knowledge about educational inequality, more broadly than that, what I do, me as a person coming out of Berkeley with this degree at this moment. And so I throw that question back at them. I actually even make it extra credit, like these little extra credit reflections. So, one of my modules, and it's a culture class, so it's quite varied, but one of them is on like religious conversion, right? Conversion into Pentecostalism and the rise of Pentecostalism across Latin America. And then I hadn't done this before, but now it's like, why do we care right now? Why? And I leave it sort of open. So aside from the theories that they learn about conversion and what that means for culture and maybe some sort of patterns of sort of religious conversion and political ideas, right now it's an interesting time with all the elections in Latin America, etc. But I leave it open-ended and I leave it for them to write it out to me, and then I discuss it. And it's about them and this moment interacting with the text and interacting with the world. And I think this is creating, I hope, a continuous reflection about themselves, about the moment, about sort of what data means, what these trends mean, where they stand in their lives. I'm hoping that gives them some ease for many of them, and for the few that I'll get, they're like 4 out of 120 something, so I actually don't expect to win them all. I actually expect that I'll get a lot of pushback. It might come because as a woman of color lecturer, I just know that I'm not going to get them all.
We have another question in here, but I was thinking that sometimes, I'm an abolitionist, so that says a lot, but often the shattering of starting points. So I often use that phrase, we can imagine the destruction of the planet, but we can't imagine the destruction of capitalism. Where do you move from a statement like that? And it starts to unpack, I think, some of the hidden narratives around what are we talking about? And I think it's this idea of stakes again. What are we talking about when we have a certain stake in the ground around a narrative that's already contained for us, rather than breaking it open? But you have a question?
Yeah. This has been touched on a little bit already. There's a phenomenon, and I can't remember the name of it, where somebody holds an opinion and they learn facts that are contrary to that opinion, and they dig in deeper into their own stance. And I think this is partially what the gentleman in front of me was saying, but have you experienced that, and what do you do around that?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I've found, and it's probably for those of you who are parents in the room, it's no different dealing with your children. You as a teacher or you as a parent can say whatever you want to the students or your children, but they don't hear it the same way as one of their peers saying it. And it's much more powerful when their peers say it. And so I've had a few times where I've had maybe a more conservative student in the classroom and who's been courageous enough to say something. And it's actually been a very valuable learning experience because the students take that more seriously, and at least until recently, they've been very civil in sort of responding. So I remember this one instance, I was giving a talk, and this is very much about the facts maybe being understood differently. This was a while back, and when Samuel Huntington very famously talked about the Hispanic threat, which was going to undermine the United States, and had a number of arguments. Yeah, there you go. A number of arguments about why this was going to be bad for the U.S. And and there are pieces of that argument which was like, English is going to be undermined, Spanish is going to be everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can show facts in terms of immigrants today learn English probably faster than they did 100 years ago by the second generation. Everybody's speaking English virtually, et cetera, et cetera. So you can show these facts. And there was a young man in the class who was a veteran. He had fought in Afghanistan, and people knew this. And he came out and he basically said, I don't understand why everyone doesn't just speak English. I just think all of these languages, this is silly. It would be much easier if everyone spoke English. And he said it in a pretty respectful way, but that's a pretty strong comment when you have 2/3 of our undergraduate population who are either first or second generation immigrants hearing something like that. And of course, immediately these students were like, what's going on? And the hard part, of course, is moderating that in a respectful way. But I allowed a number of students to give, their responses to that. And then we tried to break it up. Okay, what is going on? Like, what is the issue? Is there an economic issue? We can't talk to each other in the workplace. Is it a cultural issue? Our culture is being undermined, and like, who are we as a nation? Is it about, threat? Is it about just, so we had a conversation, and it ended up being, I think, pretty positive. I don't know if we changed his mind at all. But the other thing I said to students is you have to hear positions that you're not comfortable with because they exist outside of the Berkeley campus. And so you have to be able to answer them. And I think actually one of the bigger problems I sometimes face is that when I'm talking about immigration, people just don't want to say the Trump thing because on the Berkeley campus, there is a sense that you're not allowed to say those or you shouldn't be saying them. And I personally don't espouse them, but I do say to the students, you have to be able to answer it or at least think through it. And so let's do it in a safer spot so that when you are confronted with that in a less safe space, you have some ideas of how to react. And one student came to me afterwards and said that was a very valuable way of thinking about it because her boyfriend was from a very Republican family, and apparently the parents had said some very hurtful things or that she understood as hurtful. And so now she was thinking through strategies of how could she engage these parents or at least provide a safe space for herself that she didn't feel constantly this emotional toll every time she was hanging out with her boyfriend's parents.
Just a direct follow-up, Claire. And with the veteran, how did you go on to construct that space where it was a respectful conversation? How did that play out? Or in a situation like that, and you had mentioned when a view goes unchallenged, perhaps what do you do immediately after that somebody stands up and says something like that?
I don't know, my stomach clenches. My stomach just clenches and I'm like, oh my God.
I mean, the way I handle it, so specifically if someone makes a statement and a claim that is factually incorrect, my first step is to always, with any student from any perspective, to always provide the factual correction. And then I will often prefer to have other students kind of speak back. So I see my job, and then if they don't, then I play the devil's advocate regardless. And I think that's the part, is how we manage that conversation and how we sort of referee. And if they feel like they've been heard and not dismissed, it both makes students more willing to talk, but I think also makes other students, it models for them how they can speak back, right? And so I think that's just been my approach. I don't know if that's the right approach, but yeah, I definitely don't let things go if they're just sort of, like, no. Or just always bring it back to what's the evidence? What do we actually know about this? What really happened in history, right? That kind of stuff.
I find that in the class, it's often easy to say, just, what do you think, to the rest of the class? And so and it's actually really helpful once it's aired out. So it's aired out, and then I say, and I usually, because we're on the Berkeley campus, it takes a lot of courage for them to come out with this sort of opinion. And so I'm often, thanks for sharing that, what do you all think, right? And so we go around, and usually in my experience, students will air something, so sometimes they won't have the facts, but they'll have the sentiment that this is wrong. Like, they'll have the sense, well, how can you silence other people, or things like that, and it'll be more of perhaps the, I guess the sentiment or the political sense, and then I'll provide the facts. After sort of there's a sense of engagement, I'll ask, but this is a really big topic, and there is no, at the end of the day, what is right and what is wrong, right? And we have that conversation too. But I think, I don't know if you guys have had this, but one of my difficulties is even sort of being able to create that moment, because they're so valuable. Mm-hmm. So sometimes what I do, I construct that moment by either playing the devil's advocate right now there's so much out there in the news today that you can just sort of say, for a while I would go back to like Newt Gingrich speeches he'd say, and I don't have to do that at all anymore. I can just sort of look up something on poverty and inequality, on immigration, on sort of religion. I can sort of look it up for that day. And I could tie it into the reading, and it creates sort of the counterpoint, right, for students to talk about. But they're actually really valuable moments that sort of you want to foster, but not at all in sort of letting it hang there. And so if I don't have the facts so if something is hanging there though, and I don't have the facts to get it on hand, I'd say my sense is this, and then I'd come back at that next lecture with sort of a much more expansive answer to it. Oh, and the one thing about sort of you dig in deeper to your views, I talk about that in class. There's something about sort of giving them the studies and sort of telling them these were conducted, studies conducted in a lab or studies conducted over time, and we know that. Showing that to those students and then allowing them to sort of think about that is really good, because then it opens their eyes to sort of how are they absorbing different types of information.
Here's a very small thing. I don't know if this works, but like my stomach does clench when I have this moment where I'm like, oh my goodness, what is this all going to blow up or whatever? Mm-hmm. And so I love writing on whiteboards or blackboards. And so I start writing. And this is just to give myself like my 15 seconds to say, okay, what the hell do I do? But also by writing out what people say, the students are much more careful in what they say because I'm writing down what they say. So like someone will say something and they'll be like, well, why don't we all speak English? So then I'll put on the board English, like I'll do just putting the word English down, and then I sort of turn to the student and I'll be like, okay, so why would you say that everyone should just learn English? And then it's like, and then they have to articulate why. Is it a value? It's a cultural value. Is it about economics? Whatever. And then I just start writing these words down, and so then that also gives all the other students time to think, and then I think writing it on the board makes it more real, so you can't just blow off. But that's a minor little technique, but it's enough to cool things down a little bit. And then I try to say, okay, is this a value? Can we have an empirical discussion about this? If this was our value, what would be a research project we can do to evaluate whether we really do need English to have better economic growth? And so then I kind of elide the normative sometimes by just saying what would be the research project.
I think, Andrea, we're almost out of time, so if we can just be brief with these final comments.
I'm Andrea, I'm in the Public Service Center, and I also work with Victoria for American Cultures Engaged Scholarship. I was picking up on when you said that, and I know in sociology especially, like folks are looking for a glimmer of hope or what can I do? I wanted to mention both of those programs. ACES, of course, some folks here already know, but also in the Public Service Center, we have different social justice programs for undergrad students. So whether they spend a summer in Washington, D.C. or do an alternative break on immigration or whatever else, we have a variety of programs, and I think really getting students into communities where there are experts working on these issues every day can provide new perspectives and counter narratives. And so happy to partner with you anytime or come talk about those programs in your classrooms or
That's such a good point, Andrea. And let's give a shout out for the Democracy Camp. The IGS runs in the summer, right?
Spring break.
In spring break, great.
But I also want to say I bring the leaders from community organizations working on my issues to talk to the class. That's another easy way, if they're not, going to go out and do that, to just stories of winning, right? Stories of success. And as I talk about the history too, where are places when things have changed, and let's try to think about how and why that change happened, right? And what normal people can do to make change, right?
Yeah,
because otherwise I did have students tell me that they'd be totally depressed leaving my class, and that's really not the goal at the end of the semester. So having some place to show the ways in which actually positive changes happen, and how do we learn from that? Yeah.
And that pivot to community knowledge and engagement and active relationships to social problems, if you want support from that, contact Andrea or I. We have a whole set of toolkits and workshops and resources, real funds that can help you on that pathway. This is a massive topic area, and I just feel extremely grateful that our university can depend upon the incredible thinking, work, kindness, and generosity that shows up in our faculty. So can we please give another round of applause? And I know we said on the flyer that we wanted also this to be a space where we cultivated communication without shouting matches. So please don't shout at me, but it looks like the food is delayed. But hang around with us and hopefully it will show up. And thank you for coming. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you.